I just want to say I'm very pleased to be able to speak with Peter on this. It's a great honor to be here. I was told that this is where the first dissections took place live. I'm not hoping to dissect Peter.
That made me worried.
No. I've got no plans to do that. But what I wanted to do was to really talk about his amazing book. And for those of you who haven't read it, I think The Silk Roads will change your perspective on global history. And just as an introduction, I want to know how many people here have read or bought the book. So there's still quite a few who haven't.
There aren't enough copies outside.
That's right.
There aren't enough copies outside.
They haven't. The word hasn't spread. The word of this wonderful book, and its message hasn't reached you. And I think that's where I want to start this conversation. I was struck by the preface of your book, Peter, where you say that essentially global history, world history that we were taught, that many people here were taught at school and possibly at university, was very much a Western-centric enterprise. So I think you say in the book, and I'm not going to read, but I'm going to say that there was a sort of trajectory where Greece begat Rome, Rome begat Christian Europe, and then there's the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then we got imperialism and the rise of Western Europe and America. And I just wanted to say that one of the remarkable things about the Silk Roads is the fact that you shift the perception, you shift the center of focus. And I just wanted to ask you about that. How did you come for this insight?
Oh, small, gentle opener. Well, I suppose it's that as a boy, I couldn't understand why I was being taught about Henry VIII and his wives. A lot. I got taught, I think, Henry VIII 3 times in my school career.
Yeah, that's right.
And my children, they do exactly the same things that I learned. They learn about the ancient Romans in Britain. Then there's a 1,000-year gap where nothing matters, and we know nothing matters because it used to be called the Dark Ages, yes. There was no explanation, I think, growing up as to why there were these big chasms. And I started the book saying I had a map on my wall, and even if I look at that map today, we are, as a community, and each of you will have your own different interests, and I'm not tarring everyone with the same brush, but we are totally disconnected from the world of today around us that matters, and we're totally disconnected from their pasts. Sure. So with all these clever people here this evening, if you were to ask them how many are able to name an Arabic pop star or a Chinese novelist, these kind of very basic questions, we are detached from 80% of the world's population. And it's partly because of that straitjacket of history that we're taught. We're taught in a mantra about things that matter. That's what history lessons are for. This is how we came to be who we are. And I suppose you could make the case that that is fine 100 years ago when a quarter of the world was pink. How Britain came into being, and Henry VIII and his wives is a huge part of that, and the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the first dissections here. But I think if you found any other equivalent to the Royal Institution before 1600 or 1700, those great experiments were not happening in Europe. Those great experiments were happening in China, in Asia particularly, and in fact in the Americas as well. But that locking in of what matters in the past means that we disassociate reality. We basically create history as a sort of string of myths where we get very comfortable about what that progression that's led us to who we are today. And you have to deal with this as an MP, things like human rights and so on. It's very easy to forget that our own past in terms of human rights, protection of tolerances of sexuality, religion, skin colour, gender, etc., are deeply flawed. And I think when you take that triumphalist view that we today are the product of only things that are good, you create a story and a past that is at best, I suppose, through rose-tinted spectacles. And at worst, it's actually misleading. I took a photo of the building outside as we arrived. Why the Royal Institution is designed to look like a Roman temple or Greek temple, or we sit in this kind of model of an amphitheatre, is because we somehow have positioned ourselves to be the heirs of a classical world. And actually, that's not how the Greeks and the Romans saw things.
But one of the things that interested me about your introduction, your preface, was how you explained how you got to your own insight. Because I know you personally, we're friends, and you have a Central European background. The sorts of things you learnt were, you learnt languages, you spoke different languages at home. And that really, I think, gave you an insight that many people can't reach. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that. And then
I think languages are important. I mean, actually, I think what really matters is not speaking languages and knowing your grammar. That's obviously a sort of fundamental skill, I guess. But what is very important growing up is to realize that you don't understand the world around you. I think that was the best thing that my parents, how they brought us up, is that we'd sit at lunch and at supper and wouldn't know what anyone was talking about. You wouldn't understand why there was someone suddenly bursting into German, talking very anxiously about the Berlin Wall, or talking in Spain about Franco. And you would realize you couldn't follow the narrative. And in fact, back here in the classroom, it seemed very straightforward. Everything was logical. It all dropped into place. But I think what was important for me particularly was that when I was 15 or so, I was at a school, was very fortunate that I was able to learn Russian. And over my summer holidays, my parents left us, I'm one of 5 children, left us all on our own to get intensely bored. And we tackled that boredom through reading books. We had lots of books around. And one of the first things that I discovered as a teenage boy was Turgenev, a great Russian writer, and the first book I read is called First Love, which is quite a good thing to read as a teenage boy in the middle of a forest where there's nothing else to do. You realise that life is tragic and flawed, and the girl you're going to fall in love with is going to break your heart, and so on. It's quite a useful thing to do. And I came back to learn Russian, and my Russian teacher, who you'll know who I'm talking about, arrived at my first Russian lesson 15 minutes late.
Yes.
Singing. And it took him a few minutes to open the door.
Sure.
And he then sat down and said, look, you boys who've chosen to do Russian are either clever or worse, you think you're clever. And he said, I'm not going to teach you grammar. I'm going to teach you how to really understand a language. And I sat there, I was quite diligent, my pen poised over my, what should I write down? And he started singing again.
Yes.
And then he stopped singing and he said, if you really want to understand a language, you've got to learn to sing the songs of their peasants.
Sure.
And I think if you tried to say that today, you'd be sacked.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, you'd be sacked for being late. You'd be sacked for not being able to open the door quickly. You'd be sacked for not teaching correct Ray. You'd be sacked for the sort of. And yet, there's something very profound about this. And
is it the peasants or the?
Well, peasants in Russia means something very different.
Sure.
But I suppose it's right. If you really want to know what people think, you have to do this at the moment about Europe. Okay, you could listen to people here, or go listen to people outside a pub at closing time. Are people talking about Europe and Brexit? Right. What do people really react to? What are the real nodes that are getting them going, and how do you listen to that? And I think what was helpful was he, by default, treated us like we were grown up. So we felt that we were on our own. If you wanted to go discover things about Russia, you had to go and read.
And then you went to Cambridge. And
it helped for that. He missed my lower 6th year. He was sent out to Baghdad.
So you managed to get into Cambridge.
So he came back in my last year and said, I'll teach it. He'd been in naval intelligence.
Yes.
He came back in my last year and said, I'll teach any of you boys Arabic in a year. Okay. So by the time I went to university, I not just spoke good Russian, I had some Arabic, and I was aware that world, I'm a child of the Cold War, where we were taught to hide under something roughly this size. Right. In case of a nuclear bomb, keep your eyes closed, and somehow things would be fine.
I remember that world very well.
And of course, people under the age of 35 don't understand it. No. My students now at Oxford were born after Tony Blair became Prime Minister. So which is important, that disconnect of who was bad in the world and who was difficult and where threats came from is totally different to my perception. So I knew that I remember being sort of watching Gorbachev and Reagan signing their disarmament agreements. I remember of course the Berlin Wall coming down. I was 18 at the time, and that world changing. I already knew was going to change for good or for bad. But I also knew that whole history of east of the Berlin Wall really had mattered once upon a time, and why was it that had just been written out of the script?
And this is one of the real things that I, as a historian, someone also engaged in politics, I'm fascinated by people's ages in terms of what your experiences are. And I think it was Napoleon, and also Francis Bacon, the great English philosopher, who said that really, and I don't know whether they said this independently or not, but really you've got to look at a person between the age of 20 and 30 in terms of their formation. in terms of, and you find that again and again in public life and in literary life, that if you look at the world when you were between 20 and 30, which I would guess would be the early 90s till 2001, something like that, those were formative years. The one story I wanted to get from you, because I know you, was why you left learning Russian, because you started off learning Russian at university, and you met a very distinguished historian who said you were wasting your time, essentially, learning Russian, and you should come to learn history.
No, he didn't say I was wasting my time. He said I was wasting my time learning, it's why do you learn languages? What is the point? And how grammatically correct do you need to be? How many words, and so on. And I said, but lots of people always ask, how many languages do you speak? And it's sort of slightly how long is a piece of string, because we all know that there's a difference between talking to a taxi driver and getting to your hotel alive and not being ripped off. And if you could speak about the day's football results, amazingly, you tend to get to where you're going in Rome or in Madrid or in Istanbul much quicker and cheaper, and you engage with the driver. And there's a difference if you're trying to write poetry or whatever. And Norman Stone, who I went to go and talk to in the early 90s to get his views about the breakup of Yugoslavia, about the collapse of the Berlin Wall, was very generous with his time. But one of the first things he asked me, or after I think we're on to at least our second bottle of wine, was how many...
Only two with Norman, I'm
surprised. No, it carried on. He wanted to know how many words I knew in Russian for tomato. And I think I said, certainly 3, and I'd have if it was on a quiz show, I'd have a risky one on 4th. And he said, do you think that's maybe 1 or 2 too many? And why are you learning Russian?
That's right.
And I then went, I suppose you would now say I was radicalized by him.
Sure.
Because I went back to Cambridge and said, I'm through with this grammar and learning about moods, which are very complicated in Russian. And I feel lied to that in Russian they're very complicated endings depending on some of you will speak Russian. If a number ends in a digit below 4, it agrees in the singular. So 1,254 is singular, but 1,255 agrees in the plural. You then get off a plane in Moscow or in Irkutsk or God knows what, and you realise the Russians, they make mistakes. They've got no idea themselves. And you think, it's sort of crazy. So a lot of the languages I speak, I can't swear and I can't do slang. I have no idea what people mean. So I switched. I came back to Cambridge and I said, I want to switch to basically do Russian history, and then I worked on the Scandinavians, the Vikings, who, again, I felt, I do feel lied to that the story about the Vikings is not about Canute and Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which for reasons still unclear why that's the name of the Chelsea football stadium.
That's right. Yeah, I've never understood that either.
If you were smart, bright, ambitious, and on the make in Scandinavia, you went east, and the scale of trade and of what the Vikings were trying to do in the east was hugely important and connected. And that part of looking at the British Isles, where a longship would arrive and you'd sack a monastery and then disappear, you never quite. It seemed chaotic and disordered and so on. And in fact, anybody who's been to Scandinavia knows that Scandinavian mentality is extremely structured. And so I could never quite understand the sort of raping, pillaging Viking image that I was taught with this ordered world. And in fact, the Viking world was deeply ordered, deeply structured, like the world of the Mongols and of the Huns and all these other people we also don't understand or look at properly. But it was all connected into a Viking world where slaves particularly were brought from Dublin through to the Islamic world.
But the other thing, I'm a similar age to you. I had similar experiences. But the other thing that I found so extraordinary about your preface and your book was the fact that it made me think, as I read this book, how the world had changed. We're talking about being at university in the early 90s and what the preoccupations were, and you mentioned the Cold War. And I remember bunkers, as children that we were going to go down when the nuclear winter came. But that world very rapidly changed. And so by the time you and I were at university in the early 90s, we were in a different world. But reading your book, I just think in the last sort of 25 years, the world has totally transformed. And in a way, your book, despite its incredible historical feel and sensitivity, is really a book about the modern world, in the sense that this book couldn't have been written when we were at university. It could have been, but it would have been had a very different feel. And in a way, what's happened, I would suggest, probably in the last 25 years, is that the Silk Roads have suddenly come back into our consciousness.
Yes.
And I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
I think that's probably fair. I think that it couldn't have been written in the same way with the world of communism.
No.
I think that's right. I suppose it's something which I don't want to. It's not a personal thing, Kwasi. But I do think that it is shameful how our education system is structured in this country.
I'm not in the education department.
No, I know, but from what I understand, you have. So I know you have friends who might be. And it's shameful for lots of reasons. It's shameful because of the way we structure our society into winners and losers, in education in particular, it works that way. There are all sorts of private and state, etc., etc. But it's the thing that is as an educator myself, as an academic, the thing that I think is most shameful is the failure of an education curriculum to adapt to a world around us. So it was all very well teaching me about Henry VIII, but since I was at school, the Berlin Wall came down. China's economy quadrupled in the last, since Royal Bank of Scotland first admitted it was defrauding its customers. Apartheid ended.
Sure.
We see liberalisation and change in the Americas, I suppose, if not necessarily entirely on track, but and then Iran rejoining a family of nations, which we'll see. It's still early days.
We've got Islamic fundamentalism as well. I mean, you will remember.
Yes, we've got all of that, and I can tell you with my students. You ask the brightest of the bright in Oxford, have you read a page of the Quran? And 9 out of 10 will say no.
Sure.
You ask them if they can name a Chinese novelist or who's the greatest Chinese emperor in history.
Sure. Can't
name them. Do kids your age in Moscow today listen to Britney Spears or Justin Bieber or whoever it is? Do they? If not, who do they listen to? And how can you, as a global citizen, on the one hand, you're told by everybody about globalization, you can download stuff for free, you can listen to music for free, you can search whatever you like. How is it that we are bringing up a generation who are pressed with the same load of nonsense that we're told about? Because, for example, sitting in the Royal Institution here tonight, as a parallel, we have back in Oxford the Natural History Museum, where we have the 27 greatest scientists in history on the wall. And there's not a woman amongst them, which tells one story. There's not a single one of them. I mean, they're all names you'll know. Leonardo da Vinci, Aristotle, he's a bit of a rogue choice, maybe. Euclid, Pythagoras, Galileo, and so on. There's not a single scientist on the wall in Oxford who is not from the Western world.
That's right.
So when you have that distorted, myopic, and idiotic view of the world, it means that you are unable to understand modern Russia. You are unable to make the right decisions about how to deal with Syria and Iraq, because you've written about Ghosts of Empire, terrific book, where you've understood or tried to understand the experiment with Iraq in the 20th century.
That's right.
But it means that we now live in an age of unreason. Our views about the world around us are based on gut feeling rather than on experience or on knowledge. And so, for example, I know I'm not going to talk about Brexit, but Michael Gove, separate to the Brexit discourse, part of the Brexit discussion, in a way that you can get trapped in TV interviews. It doesn't, you can't be pinned by it, but said, we live in a world where we're sick of listening to experts because they're normally wrong. That single comment from the former education secretary is a shameful indictment.
Well,
I'm not asking you to defend Michael Gove, and I'm not trying to attack Michael Gove. Actually, I'm really not. I mean, maybe I could or should, but that's a different story.
You already have.
No. I think that is symptomatic of a way in which we engage with this world. That we should rely above all on how we feel and what we think. And if I ask for a show of hands in here, who thinks that Putin is a strong leader, good leader, etc., everyone would. Well, there's one. Okay.
Not everyone.
Or we talk about Iran or the Middle East. We tend to lead with our fists rather than lead with our brains.
But yeah, we're speaking in 2016, and we look back on the last 20 years, and I think a lot of your judgments are fair. I think what I would say, and what this book really brought out to me, was how quickly things changed. The world. I remember leaving university. I graduated in 1996. And really, in 1996, if we can go back, I remember the American presidential election that year, and the Republican ticket was Dole and Kemp. I mean, this is a very, very different world, very kind of establishment, very safe, Fukuyama's end of history. And of course, nobody in 1996 could have depicted the world of 2016.
Well,
I think,
and the thing in that, I think we have to be sanguine about the role of historians, because I don't believe that there is this sort of shifting of the gears where suddenly there is a rhythm of how the world develops. And, in fact, it's not 96. The right point to measure from, I'd have thought, would be August or September the 10th, 2001.
yes, that was the clear
And at that point, what the action of 19 lunatics did with their backup of flying planes into targets in the United States, that dislocation, what it should teach us, there are lots of different messages it should teach. As a historian, the story is not about terrorism, fundamentalism, ideas in religion, and so on and so forth. The point, I think, is to underline that fragility of the world which we live in, and that fragility by which these are not unusual events. No. The fact that a single attack, but unexpected, at the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, can profoundly affect our world, is something that has been the case for thousands of years.
I think I would slightly disagree with you in the sense that to say that they are unusual events, it's just that there are lots of times when unusual events happen.
Well, yeah, I go back to my table, Kwasi. I was brought up in a world where nuclear war was a question of when, not if. And arguably, however terrible the world is today, we are presumably better off today than we would have been with nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and Russia and the United States. But we can fall into that trap, I think, of feeling that we're somehow living through unusual times. And I think if this book tells you something, it's that those big switches of global centers of gravity you can't stop them. No. There are fundamental truths, there are fundamental reasons for those shifts.
But where I would slightly differ from you, I mean, you're an academic, I am a politician in terms of sort of day job. And actually, I think from the academic's point of view, I think you're sort of in touch with the rhythms.
Yes.
Walking through the parks in Oxford or wherever it might be.
Don't patronise me.
No, but it's a slightly different. Whereas people who are, who feel that they are, in the centre of Westminster or Whitehall, the view from there is one of constant crisis management for lots and lots of different reasons. And so a lot of the issues that have emerged.
Well, because MPs, with all due respect, tend to think they're incredibly important.
No, they do, but all politicians do.
Yes, they do. And it might well be that actually, when the waves are breaking, there's nothing that you or all your colleagues could do to stand in the way. And in fact, at the moment, how I see it in the world, we talked a little bit about it outside, and it's not a discussion about Europe. For me, what is important in today's world in 2016, the future of Europe is a sideshow in a much, much bigger picture of where change is happening. And we have no engagement at all in the discussions about the 23rd of June, about how and what world of Russia, the Middle East, Iran, China, Pakistan and India, 80% of the world's population, huge amounts of growth. And I think that is a product of the straitjacket of our education. It's because MPs are always worrying about crisis management.
Yeah, we are.
There's always trying to mop up what did Michael Gove say about experts on TV and how do you back out of it without sort of being inelegant and stop cheap shots. And that's not the point of it. But I think that walking around the parks, that world that you talk of, funnily enough, I think I have a greater level of responsibility than an MP. Because if you get this wrong, if you don't present your ideas entirely accurately, entirely rightly, there is no back out of, I just made a mistake, or let me clarify. You put your heart and your soul on a page, you let yourself be judged by your academic communities, and by, in the national press, international presses, and it has to actually stack up. You have to have done your research. You can't guess what's going to happen in the future. This book isn't about what's going to happen. It's about how we've reached where we are today.
But this is where, in terms of the process and the mindset, it's a very different thing, because and you said you're quite right. I mean, politicians think they're self-important and all the rest of it. But the kind of mindset that they have, given the 24/7 media, given the constituency constraints and that pressure, means that the way in which they approach problems is very different.
Agreed. So are there any other MPs apart from Kwasi here tonight?
I wouldn't
not one. I can tell you the number of approaches I've had and contact with Chinese government of Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Central Asian states, other governments in Europe, and this in the UK. I'd be very surprised or interested to know how many of your colleagues have read the book. But I don't get my phone doesn't ring from Westminster.
No, it wouldn't, because the British political system is notoriously focused on the short term for lots and lots of reasons, lots of historical reasons. And you're much more likely to get a reader of your book, frankly, in Berlin or Rome, among the political class, than would be the case in London. And I think that's a great shame. But from the point of view of someone who is involved in politics, you've got a situation in which the British public is probably the least deferential in the world. You've got a media which was described by Tony Blair as a feral media. You've got a situation in which, let's be frank, people working in the public sector broadcasting, Jeremy Paxman or whoever, is earning 5 times as much as the Prime Minister. I mean, in terms of the power and the influence.
Yes, but Kwasi, then read it again, not as an MP, because if you want to see proper hatchet jobs, go and read accounts of 6th century Constantinople.
No, I'm not. Okay.
Don't complain about Jeremy Paxman when you've got Procopius, who damns you for 1,500 years.
That sounded awful. I mean, I wasn't trying to make a defense. I was just trying to describe a media world and a media and political
But media
world
as a historian, that just means the sources. That doesn't mean any. I mean, you are always held up to account.
I'm not complaining about scrutiny, and I'm not complaining about. I'm just describing a world in which the media in Britain, the fourth estate, as Lord Macaulay
commentators. We call them commentators.
But
why is that different from late antiquity, the Chinese court, or
I think
the
it's
Byzantine
slightly
world?
different because the Byzantine emperor and certainly the Chinese emperor, they could, if they got very cross, get your head chopped off. Whereas I don't think that David Cameron quite has those powers. I'm sure he would like to have them, but it's a very different dynamic of power. I mean, what I wanted to move on to was precisely this question of.
But to be fair, we do that with the BBC. We've shut down the Russian service of the BBC, which has been a hugely damaging to save peanuts in the grand scheme of things. I mean, I think your point, and it's about the death of democracy, is also something that I want to bring in here. Is that you're absolutely right about planning for tomorrow and the immediacy, and that's a real challenge. I don't have any doubt how difficult the day-to-day life of an MP is, or Kwasi is the smartest man I know. So I don't understand.
He's always complaining I'm not a minister. Well, I wouldn't be able to write books, frankly, if I were.
You have time to do that. I can't understand how a government which wants to promote talent can't promote a double first, Cambridge PhD, brilliant writer, someone who is sensitive, smart, and so on. I can't understand it.
It's very. But there are.
And although Kwasi said I'm a friend of his, I'm not that good a friend. I mean, I'm not. I'll be very happy.
We don't call each other every day.
No, but I think that there is a question mark about the fact that we are structurally set up to fail in this country, and in other parts of the world, where there are powers that maybe a leader would like in an ideal world to have, the scrutinies and so on. States are able to plan for the long term.
That's right.
The current Chinese cycle of the One Belt, One Road, the sort of the new Silk Roads being planned by China, the current working cycle runs up to 2049.
Sure.
It's a 35-year cycle where plans, investment, infrastructure are being done. Here, we don't know what the world's going to look like on the 24th of June.
Well, the classic, my constituency instance is that we don't know. I've got an issue with a third runway in Heathrow, which is right next to my constituency.
Right.
And generally, people like. I hope there's nobody who's massively campaigning against the third runway here. Maybe there are. But the third runway is something I've supported. But the more relevant point is that we haven't worked out whether we want a third runway or not. And this is a debate that's been going on about 20 years. Literally. I go to Dubai, I meet ministers in Dubai, and they say, we're really pleased that you're indecisive because Dubai is going to overtake Heathrow in 3 months' time. And you're absolutely right to
well, in HS2 it's going to be the same problem, which will
right.
be chronically over budget. It'll take 20 years. Was it 20 years, something like that, or however long it's going to take?
That's right.
So, to give you a sense of the scale, so in 2015, 7,500 containers were shipped from China to Europe by train. By 2020, that will have risen to 7.5 million. Okay.
That's right.
So the scale of which new worlds are being knitted together. Infrastructure is being created, whether it's through motorways, whether it's through train lines, whether it's through new airport hubs, whether it's through basic interventions of government to try to build things that people in developing parts of the world need, like in Pakistan, sanitation or energy plants that mean you have you can keep the lights on all the time or your internet doesn't drop out. those kinds of things, that sort of, that idea where your help is actually practical and well-directed, we are out of position.
But you see, the world you describe and the world that we have in Britain, the two kind of mindsets are very different. So, the countries that we've described, when I speak to Dubai, there's a very central commanding authority who decides, generally it's Sheikh Maktoum, or if it's in Dubai, it's the Al Nahyans, and they say we want to have a 3-runway international airport, and it gets done.
Right.
And China's very much the same. It's a very centralized system, and the worlds that you describe in this book, is a world of emperors, of great khans, of warlords, people who exercise a huge amount of authority with what Clausewitz called the unity of command. A highly developed modern democratic system, like the one that we have here, I'm afraid, doesn't act with that sort of
so here's the problem.
quickness.
It's how we look at the past. And actually, Britain's greatest glories were at a time when we weren't democratic.
So are you suggesting
at a time when we had very small elites making decisions for
that's
so you could cut it both ways, which is we've reached the stage where democracy is our golden our golden measure, because we've seen what happens that in the continent of Europe we're able to murder 6 million Jews in the Holocaust because we only decriminalised homosexuality in 1967. I think that's correct. We have we realise how brutal we are able to treat other people in our own continent. And although we have the joke, we should leave Europe and stop the German advance going up on billboards. The 20th century, in terms of bloodshed, how we treated each other, was in a way that defies all belief.
But this is my question. You've posed an interesting problem. The title is "The Death of Democracy," part of the title of the talk. But what is? You've described a world in which democracy, at some level, isn't working in the Western world, and to me, that's self-evident. I don't know how a figure like Donald Trump emerges as the Republican nominee for president. Something's gone wrong. He's an entertaining guy, he's a showbiz guy, but
I think
the system wasn't designed.
But then you've got to, I think, butter the bread both sides. So there's Trump, but there's also Bernie Sanders. Both are talking to a constituency.
I completely agree with
and there is something you've got to listen to. What it is that is catching the tide? And with those kinds of things, I suppose there are different. You could give a different answer, but all of which are true. One is rising levels of inequality. So in the United Kingdom, for example, as you all know, Kwasi, because you're broad-minded, we now rank on the World Bank Gini Index. We are more socially stagnant in this country than Sierra Leone, Niger, or even Kazakhstan. So it means that if you're born in the bottom 20% of this country, you are stuck there.
But forgive me, you do what academics really do very well. You've described the problem brilliantly.
Yes.
And but I'm just wondering, how do we? You've said that democracy has its failings. What are you proposing? Do you think we should get rid of our democracy, get something else?
No, Kwasi, you're the one who chose a life of politics.
No, I'm opening. You're a smart guy.
I'm waiting to serve. All I need is a phone call.
You're a smart guy. I'm just thinking, it's very interesting. And the worlds to which you describe, it's not a democratic world. And that's the part of the richness of it.
Which world?
The world of the Silk Roads. The worlds, rather, of the Silk Roads.
Yes.
It's a world of empire building. It's a world of trade routes. It's a world of excitement. It's a world of intellectual endeavor.
Yes.
It's a world of intellectual curiosity. But it's not a world of mass democracy. You talk a bit about the end.
Democracy, we can forget, is the great gift of prosperity. Okay, when you are prosperous and wealthy, you can afford to be open-minded and tolerant. And one of the great worries, I think, of the Western world, Britain, France, Western Europe, United States, are those rising levels of intolerance and the kinds of things you all know about, with Trump's comments about Mexicans, about Muslims, and so on, are hugely damaging. And they have repercussions not just for how we see it, but in large parts of the world where this is reported, and this does proper damage. But I think that is a symptom, and it must be a symptom, of the fact that we are acutely aware that the world in Britain, the Western world of tomorrow, is worse than the world of today. Well, it is going to be worse for our children, it's going to be worse for our grandchildren than it was for us and for our grandparents. And that's even with the context of global warfare. So, the Financial Times, I'm absolutely clear about the rising levels, both of inequality, but also the fact that it's the first generation in recorded or European history where it's guaranteed that the standard of living of the next generation is going to be worse than ours. And I think it stands to reason as a historian, Britain's last 300 years, which were by and large pretty good, it's unlikely that those next 300 years will match it.
But the question, I mean, when you talk about 300 years, I'm reminded of the story of the, forgive me, Oxford Don.
Yeah.
And do you remember they're sitting in Christchurch or whatever, and
yes.
the bursar says, well,
actually, it's Peterhouse, Cambridge.
Is it Peter?
They bought the long lease of a hotel site from Goldman Sachs. And I think it has 300 years to run.
Something like that.
And they said, but do you understand, it's not 30 years, you haven't misread it. And he said, no, we at Peter's plan for the long term.
That's right. And they said, well, the story I read, I mean, it's an apocryphal story, but the story was about 1940. And they said, well, of course, our land investments have done very well in the last 300 years. And I can't remember this is.
Yeah.
And then the Don said, well, you do realize the last 300 years have been very exceptional. In terms of the, so that was the.
Well, he was right.
That was the long view. That was my version of the story. But I think that and I'm very wary of making predictions like that.
Yes.
In terms of what will happen, because no one really foresaw the internet. No one really foresaw. I mean, you would not in 1995, certainly not in 1990, have foreseen Facebook. Google and all the companies. So there's lots of technological innovation that can happen. But I'm interested in this idea.
That's not the worry. The greatest fragilities to our society, right, to our world, are an engagement with the Seventh Fleet over Chinese airspace.
Yes.
Where there is, there's a proper, if 9/11 teaches us something, is that a single act, or effectively a single act, of dislocation, violence, unpredictable event, can dislocate the global financial community to the point that if you look at it, I suppose, as a global historian, it's an extraordinary chain of events. But those 9/11 attacks have helped clean up the banking industry, because how money laundering works, how the scrutiny that banks are put under in Central America, the United States, and here is a direct result of preventing terrorist money flows.
You mentioned the Seventh Fleet and the China Seas. I just wanted to pin you down on China. Because I've got a certain view of China from your book, and I've got a certain view of China from reading other books. I mean, to what extent do you think China represents a geopolitical threat? I mean, to what extent do you think the Middle Kingdom, the Chinese Empire, the Chinese Communist state is an expansionist, insurgent power in the modern world? Because there are lots of different views about this. Well, there are two principal views.
Yes.
And where do you sit? Do you think that the next world war, if there is going to be a world war, will be between China and
I think
the US?
both these views, I think, are totally flat wrong. I mean, one is dreamt up in West Point by American military strategists who've read Samuel Huntington, who talk about the world as a clash of civilizations, and China's going to rise, and that will threaten the American way. And then there's the benign, it doesn't make any difference, it's all going to be lovey-dovey, and so on. I think that those are both oversimplistic, and so on. I mean, it's very simple with China. There's a population of between 1.2 and 1.5 billion. It's clear that the Chinese themselves are not absolutely sure what their numbers are. But at the moment, the Chinese consume 48% of the world's pigs, about 45% of the world's steel. Now they've liberated the one-child policy. China's population is going to grow significantly, and Chinese, whatever the slowdown is going to mean, or the new normal, Chinese energy consumption in the next 15 years is going to treble. So China, forget about it wanting to take on and create problems with any of its neighbours, needs to work out how to do the best job it can for its own citizens. How does it have access to the right commodities that it needs? How does it have access to clean energy? How does it have enough access to foodstuffs? How does it try to build investments across the world that will allow China to be able to function? And they know, the Chinese, like all good functioning states know, is that the greatest risks are instabilities, and the Chinese are really having to work hard
But how does China interact with the rest of the world? I mean, I know it has to deal. I mean, every state has to deal with internal pressures.
You tell me, Kwasi, we have spent zero effort in this country, dealing with Russia, with Iran, with Central Asia, with India, with Pakistan, with China. These countries crying out we can throw a state visit every now and again, but we make no investments. We make
some investments. I mean, it's unfair to say that we don't. The private sector doesn't invest in these countries. I mean, we export capital to these places.
But, one of the great tragedies, I think, of the last 15 or 20 years has been the failure of the British political elite to engage with their peers in other countries.
I think that's a fair point. I mean specifically with regard to certain departments of state. But I won't go there. So we'll move on.
No, I'm not trying to trap you. I think it's that we have turned in on ourselves here. 150 years ago, if you were a schoolboy at Haileybury, your Wednesday evening homework was translation from Persian to Hindi.
Yeah.
We understood.
And what do you do on a Wednesday night?
I do Hindi to Persian, just for fun.
Just for fun.
Yeah,
No,
translate David Bowie lyrics into Arabic.
I think you have. I think you make. I mean,
I think the point, Kwasi, is that we are detached. We are disengaged from the world around us and the world that matters. The world's fastest 20 growing economies, not a single one of them is in the Western Hemisphere or the Americas. Right. And it's not just opportunities for investment and so on. The great challenges all come from these parts of the world. And I think it's very striking. And I'm not trying to, it's not about individuals, it's not about departments. But, we do not have a friend here in Britain, but you could add Europe to that, actually. So it's not but east of Venice. We don't like Erdogan, we don't like Putin, don't like the Saudis, don't like the Iranians.
Well, we quite like. I mean, let's. I don't think you're right about that.
If you were a Saudi advisor, would you say that their relations and the view of the Saudis in governments in the corridors of power in Europe are balanced and fair?
I don't think it. I mean, you see, because forgive me. I think you're conflating a lot of things. So there was actually a debate this morning in Westminster Hall about Saudi Arabia. And if you read the debate,
who took part of that?
It was SNP called. It was an opposition day debate.
The SNP?
The SNP.
The Scottish National Party?
The Scottish National Party. And they're very hostile to Saudi Arabia, by the way.
Are they? Because
for various reasons.
Based on...
For humanitarian reasons,
right.
For and also the strategy of the SNP is they speak a lot about foreign affairs because their ambition is to be an independent country. And they take the view wisely that one of the things that marks an independent country is a well-developed interest and policy in foreign affairs. So they do lead these debates. Now, if you were to look at that debate, you would see that there were people on the Conservative side, on the Labour side, other sides, who were actually more supportive of Saudi Arabia than the SNP. So within the West, I don't think it's right to say that we're sort of friendless and we don't engage with these people. The problem that we've got in the West is that there are lots of different voices. So if you look, and I find this when I go in the Middle East, they say, oh, I read The Guardian, you hate us, you say terrible things, and I say, that's one section of British opinion. There's a large section of British opinion. Yeah, try it, exactly. Absolutely right. So you made the point against yourself beautifully. Yeah. Against that point that you were making. So there's a wide range of... But I think your broader issue about engagement with the world is
so, for example, this week, as you'll know, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the sanctions against Iran come to an end this year.
That's right.
And almost certainly the Iran deal is going to be either turned down or more sanctions will be reimposed.
Yeah. Well, you see, but the issue there is that the Saudis were very hostile to the Iran deal. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say on the one hand that America's not engaging with Iran by rejecting the nuclear deal, and also alienating Saudi Arabia because they're mutually. Well, I'm a
Byzantine historian by training.
Yes, that's right.
And what you learn in the Byzantine world is that you need to play every side. And you learn, and the Byzantines, it's a terrible word in English, by the way. Byzantine, it's sort of smoke and mirrors. It's all sort of untrustworthy. Kwasi will know, as you all know, because you're engaged here on a Thursday evening when you could be getting ready to watch the cricket highlights or something else, you'll all know that the Byzantine Empire actually was called the Roman Empire. It was the Eastern Roman Empire that functioned for 1,000 years. And it functioned in a way that, maybe we should learn more from in Europe. And I don't just mean European Union. It was multi-climatic, multi-regional, multi-linguistic, multi-faith, multi-regional. It worked incredibly well. And it was... The worst place to be, by the way, if you want to build an empire, is to be in the middle, because you can get attacked by everybody. Sure. Our greatest calling card in this country, the reason we did so well, was because we don't have any land borders across Europe. Right. And so at a time when the French, the Austrians, the Germans were having to put hundreds of thousands of men into uniform, we could invest all of our money and energy into shipbuilding and the chances of us being invaded by sea were always pretty small. And it meant that as our economy grew, and we had higher calorie counts, all this stuff is in the book. It's a terrific read, by the way.
It's very good.
Your physical location matters. And in the Byzantine world, surrounded by everybody, what you had to learn how to do is never to alienate people. You had to do your very, very best to keep your thoughts hidden. You had to work out how to prepare for the fact that the person you're dealing with today may have a bowstring tied around his neck in the middle of the night and you're dealing with his absolute rival. And that ability to be fleet of foot is crucially important for long-term planning. And so I don't agree with you. I think you do need to play both sides. You need to find a way where you have doors that are always open on all sides and be trying to play it on. And so your Iran and Saudi one, I would throw in, with Putin, what kind of channels of communication one's able to keep open?
The problem with my understanding of the Byzantine world in which you operate is that and actually it's a pre-internet world, which we sort of remember, is that you could get away with saying different things to different people in a way that in the modern world, in the internet world, it's very tricky to do that. It's very difficult for John Kerry to say to the Iranians, we love you, you're my best friend.
This time last year,
and at the same time, to go to Riyadh.
This time last year, John Kerry gave an interview on NBC which said that we're thinking of using the nuclear option against Iran.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't the smartest thing maybe to say, but what I'm saying is that there's the world of total transparency. And as a historian, and you will have seen this, and I tried this. I mean, there was a man called Faisal II of Iraq, who was king of Iraq in 1958. He was brutally deposed in 1958. And he happened to have a house in my constituency. I mean, it's just a pure coincidence. But the house was sort of raised. And I wanted to do some research, and I managed to get his will and lots of things online.
He was killed. He was executed. Had his legs chopped off, or his feet chopped off, dragged
Nasty
through the streets.
things happened to him. Yeah. Very bad things. And also his chief minister, Nouri al-Said, who dressed as he tried to escape Baghdad dressed as a woman in a full chador.
Yeah.
And I think his shoe slipped off. And
that's right. He got caught.
They worked out that they saw his ankle, and it wasn't a perfectly formed female ankle. And it ended badly for him. But the point I wanted to make was that in terms of disclosure and what we call Byzantine, it's famously called Byzantine diplomacy. It's very difficult to conduct a kind of Byzantine system of diplomacy in a world of WikiLeaks, Facebook, Freedom of Information Act, and the internet. That's all I was.
Well, funny enough, in fact, the WikiLeaks. I mean, I was very lucky when I wrote this book. You get to the 20th century, and it's you think that the story's familiar, fair. I mean, what can you really say interesting about the Second World War, or particularly about the last 20 years? It's all quite fresh in our minds, and so on. And in fact, there is an enormous amount of material in the Russian, the stuff I've written about the Second World War. I think hopefully will change how we look at what was really going on with the invasion of the Soviet Union and how important Iran, Iraq, and so on were even then. But I was very lucky. Three things happened for the most recent period. First, WikiLeaks, which is kind of, there is something there of the indiscreet, finding out that Jennifer Lopez was paid to sing at a 17-year-old birthday party and so on, and corrupt elites. Okay, fine. The Edward Snowden stuff, equally, is not that much that we don't already know. What was particularly interesting was the underneath the presidential palace in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein had recorded every conversation he had, and that archive was all being started to be transcribed, and you can play through things like when Saddam Hussein listens to Ronald Reagan taking the airwaves in 1986, saying, "My fellow Americans, 3 months ago, whatever it was, I told you that we would never be selling weapons to Iran at a time when the United States was bad, it was breaking the law to its own laws to sell weapons to Iran and supporting Iraq at the same time." My heart still tells me that's true, or my head now tells me that's wrong. And Saddam Hussein presses the off button and says, what is it with these guys that they are arming our enemy while at the same time trying to help us? So that is more damaging than WikiLeaks. And the stuff that has been declassified by the Senate trying to work out what went wrong in Afghanistan and Iraq is the most damning of all, where you can see across 5 slides of a PowerPoint presentation Donald Rumsfeld's invasion plans for Iraq. And when you see it in its absolute horror, and you see what you talked exactly right about, that short-termism, that need for a head on a plate, that need for vengeance, that need for action rather than thinking, it takes you back to Strabo writing in the 1st century saying, what is it about Europeans that they always try to solve their arguments through force rather than through reason? And and the Iraq and Afghanistan, one can over-focus on it to think that this was exceptional. But actually, you know that those interventions are not the last 20 or 30 years. They are interventions in the 1970s. They're interventions in the 1950s. They're interventions in the 1940s, 1930s. And in fact, that way in which we have engaged in these parts of the world is not a recent phenomenon led by a particular bad breed of Tony Blair and so on and so forth. It's a constant. It's a constant failure to engage and understand.
And this links back to what you were saying at the beginning, where I have a slight disagreement. I think these are very unusual times. I mean, all times are unusual to a degree. But I think the way in which public opinion, Thomas Carlyle famously said, force of public opinion, what king can withstand thee? But actually, it's far more accentuated now because of the technological revolution that we've seen really in the last 25 years.
Yes,
and I think the pressures and the 24/7 media...
That might be the tail wagging the dog. I think that rise of populism that we see in the modern world is maybe facilitated by the fact that people can tweet whatever comments Donald Trump might make, and it goes around the world quicker.
No, but he tweets them. That's
the speed is what's interesting. It goes quicker, that we can see it in real time. And I'm sure all of you tweeting saying how articulate Kwasi is this evening. So the speed is important, but actually I don't think that it's that dramatically exciting or different. I think what's clear to me, or I think anyway, is that the greatest troubles we have now is how do we prevent those feelings of isolation, those feelings of exclusion that are articulated with, on the one hand, with rising anger and fundamentalism, with migration, all these kind of things that are poisoning the waters, because there are fundamental issues that underpin all of those.
Okay, I've just received a note, which is probably...
It's over.
Not for you and me a bit, but I want to throw this discussion, very interesting discussion, free-ranging discussion, open to the floor. So if you've got questions, I'd be very grateful if you could stick your hands up so that I can see who to ask. So this gentleman here... I'll take two or three.
There's a microphone with a chap in blue.
Okay, I'll take 2 or 3 in groups, if that's all right. I'll ask this gentleman here at the front, this man here in the blue shirt, and one from this side.
Mike is there.
Okay, this gentleman here. And I don't want just to ask men, by the way, because that always happens. That always happens. So if you go first. It was just this man at the front here.
Okay, so would you agree that the current world conflict is between globalism on the one hand and identity on the other? And if so, which side will win?
Okay, so we've got globalism, just hold that thought. Globalism and identity, this gentleman here.
What do you mean by death of democracy? I didn't really figure out what you guys were, what was the premise of the cause of it and the return of history.
Okay.
I think my question kind of chimes with that, actually. If I understand you correctly, you were saying that democracy is born of prosperity as a system of government. If that's the case, and if our prosperity, at least in relative terms, which I think is what you're saying, is declining, is set to decline, does that mean that our democracy doesn't have a future either?
Okay, so let me summarize that. We've got globalization and identity as a conflict. We've got a gentleman here who's questioning the title, and legitimately so, but it was a free-ranging... You're not a mathematician, are you? Oh, good. I was at college with lots of mathematicians who were very literal-minded.
Yes.
But he's not. And a gentleman here with asking about democracy and prosperity. So would you like to kick off on any of that?
Well, okay, so I'll start with the last one. So democracy, I think, was it's how long is a piece of string, I suppose, and I don't want to go into lecture mode. But, the reason why there was emancipation of the genders in and proper suffrage in this country after the First World War was because of suffering, because of so many people had been killed in the First World War, and women had been seen to have had a good war by helping out factories and not throwing bricks through windows like the suffragettes had been doing before 1914. So at that point, we forget, I think, that Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan allowed women to vote before we did in Britain. And so I think that there is a sort of point at which we are able to be tolerant of each other's views and opinions when the garden is bursting with fruit. States and countries, regions, empires, doesn't matter whether it's a democratic system or not, where people are worried, where they're fearful, where they are scared about being able to feed their children and worried about the world getting tougher and meaner, more difficult, tend to make bad decisions when it comes to voting. And 1930s Germany, I think, is the most useful example of that. I suppose you might as well throw in Austria in the 1930s as well, where more than 90% voted for the Anschluss. Where you have economic contraction, you find fear being bred, and fear is a highly emotional. It's the strongest of all of our emotions because it makes us make those short-term decisions, and it makes us uncharitable, ungenerous. So we've had 100 years, I think, despite the First and Second World War, of hope and optimism. And in terms of what is the future for democracy, I think with any luck, what we have learned is that the cost and the price of treating people disgracefully is something which we need to avoid. But I think that in this, looking at Brexit in 3 weeks' time, about half the population are going to be unhappy. Whichever.
Problems that relate to our prosperity that we can't afford the luxury of a democratic solution to.
Well, I think it all depends. It all depends on what the aim, what the purpose of the state is, and people lose confidence in the state when it doesn't tax correctly or when it doesn't seem to improve the qualities of life. I think that the primary function of a state is to try to create a meritocracy where the best rise to the top regardless of their backgrounds, incomes, and so on, where ability counts for everything. And we have a problem with that, I think, in this country, the way we're set up, particularly with our educational system. But I think that the role of a state needs to be constantly trying to narrow the gap between the top and the bottom. There are all sorts of ways which,
I just want to answer some of the other questions, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry.
No, I'm done.
Okay.
We've seen there are ways in which that gap gets narrowed in communism that doesn't work particularly well.
So with globalization and identity, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think it's a difficult month to be talking about identities. It's a live, hot topic, and everyone will have their own view on it. I mean, I don't think there's identities are as much in the eye of the beholder as the person who's looking.
But I think you've clearly hit on something in terms of, if I look at what's going on in America with the rise of Donald Trump, or a lot of the discussion about, and it's not just in this country. I mean, in Europe, and we mentioned Austria, but we didn't mention the fact that little more than a few weeks ago, an avowed neo-Nazi, more or less, without the nasty bits, I think he described himself, almost won the chancellorship of that country. I have very little doubt that Marine Le Pen will almost certainly win the first round in the presidential election in France next year, which is an extraordinary occurrence. So there's clearly an issue with in terms of internationalism, the free movement of peoples, all of that, and what people perceive to be a kind of national identity that they feel they need to preserve.
Because we feel that we can't afford the quality of life that we're used to.
There's a bit of that.
And as a result, we feel that there must be ways in which we can stop it, whether it's through migration, whether it's through withdrawal from the EU, whether it's whatever. It's a sense that there must be some other way in which we can carve things up. Maybe there are efficiencies through taxation, where we deal with the NHS, who knows. Sure. There's got to be a way in which we can streamline and trim down. And that, I think, tells, regardless of what I think the solution is to that I think tells its own story, that it is right that the West is declining, and it will decline. In the same way, and I write in the book, there was, until 1500, Europe really was a regional backwater. It was a sideshow in that story of what was important in the world.
I think, and actually to the gentleman about the return of history, I understand that this is a new type of history in terms of its shift of focus. Certainly from the history that Peter learnt, and the one I was sort of bred and almost indoctrinated with, Henry VIII and his wives and all that kind of stuff. And the death of democracy, I think, is perhaps an overstatement. But I think there's clearly a crisis I mean, as a practicing politician, someone who's involved in the political process, there's definitely in the West a kind of crisis of democracy. So I would probably soften the second part of...
But I think, again, that needs to be open, from a point of view of Turkey, point of view of Russia, point of view of China, point of view of large parts of the world, democracy is so I'm not just talking, it's not just about Britain. I think you do admiral, the way the House of Commons, like a legal system, it's gold-plated for good reason, arguing these things through. It's hugely important. And, one of the great things we're able to do is listen to other people's views and try and be rational with them. By and large, it works pretty well here. But I think that there is a process by which that end of democracy or death of democracy isn't about Britain and about the rise of the right. It's about new emerging states that are also confident about how they do things, that don't see democracy. Partly because in other parts of the world, the Holocaust wasn't perpetrated. Persecution of people because of their skin colour, because of their race, because of their religious beliefs didn't happen. And, those I write in my book, this idea that the world is a violent one is a profoundly European one, because our history is about warfare, it's about castles, it's about knights, it's about unilateralism, it's about kings, and that struggle to make everybody equal. In parts of the world that I work on, Russia maybe fits somewhere more towards us, but other parts of the world, I've just been in Central Asia, people from different tribal backgrounds, from cities and different, they get on with each other. They don't have
Your book does portray a very violent Central Asia. I mean, let's not say that all the violence was coming from Europe. I mean, Genghis Khan and
for sure you have a...
you mentioned those people in the book.
Well, part of the thing that you do when you're writing about the expansion of the Arab Empire or of...
Can I get questions? Because it's not...
Yeah, that comes to mind. Sign up and study at Oxford and I'll get the full hour.
So we'll take this lady here in the white.
Okay, so I think I remember a quote saying that democracy thrives on humility, and so shouldn't basically schools introduce education on character? Wouldn't that be a common ground? Because, it's an indirect way to kind of respect your neighbor. And
so schools...
Character formation.
And character formation. That sounds very familiar. In your case.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm surprised that Francis Fukuyama has not got more of a mention in this debate.
I did mention him. You did mention
him, but very briefly. His thesis was that Hegel had won out over Marx. Marx was wrong, Hegel was right. Liberal democracy was going to be the way of the world. That's where we were all going. He didn't know about Islamic societies. He set them on one side as a kind of question mark at the time. I think that that question mark has become much more dominant and a much more prominent problem. So, I mean, are you saying that Fukuyama was wrong? We are no longer on a trajectory towards the world becoming gradually more liberal and democratic, and that we don't know where we're going to go.
So I'll answer that one. My mother told me when I was growing up, if I don't have anything nice to say about someone, just don't say anything at all.
So he's answered the question.
I was quite impressed by Francis Fukuyama.
Yes, well, I think he was wrong, wasn't he? So I mean, that's not the world. That's not the world. That's not the world. It's not the world. I mean, everyone's different. That's not how the world looks like to me.
I think the point about the Fukuyama. I mean, I read the book as an undergraduate, and I think it was so much a product of the Cold War. It was so much a product of the elation that we felt when the Soviet Union was dead and that the Berlin Wall came down, and it felt like liberal democracy and McDonald's and the internet would take us to a world of harmony and sort of utopian sort of prosperity. But of course, 9/11, Islamic fundamentalism, the increase of religious fervor in global politics.
Russian intervention in the Ukraine, the total failure of the United Nations to feature in any of the major discussions or problems of the last 15 or 20 years, the rise of China, unfettered, and so on and so forth. I think one could catalogue through proving, the mathematical proof of where Fukuyama maybe. I think it's right. Kwasi said that it was a product of its time.
Yeah.
As far as the character formation, I agree. I mean, as a father, I try to bring up my children. What I've learned from being a father, and I think what I learned about myself as a result, is that where we tend to learn is when you make mistakes. You tend to learn when you get things wrong in business. You tend to learn when you get things wrong, and you give a talk about the death of democracy. People don't agree with you. You're then forced to go and reflect. Those moments are very positive and very important. How children tend to be brought up now through the school system is to be overpraised and over-pushed and over-goaded. And I think character formation and resilience and so on are things that are incredibly important. And by and large, private schools tend to do those quite well. I'm involved with something called the Sutton Trust, which is incredibly important in terms of trying to convince kids from state schools who are bright to even apply to the great universities, to give them the confidence to go and stand out and shout and sing and perform. But character development, I think, is the kind of the new way in which smart teachers are trying to bring up through the education system.
Okay, more questions. I'll probably take 3 now. This lady in the front, directly in front of me in the blue shirt, light blue shirt. Yep, no, I'm looking around. Sorry, I'm just, at the top. Oh, there. Sorry, I didn't see this man here. You're second. Sorry, I'll just ask this lady first.
What would you say actually about the emerging economies, especially like Russia's and China? They have been taking over the world and becoming more important politically and economically, partly because of the authoritative style of government that they're having. But to relate to your questions, to one of your comments about Britons about 300 years ago, is that 300 years ago it was much better than now. Are you talking about economic superiority of Britain before? Because one of the Cambridge economists, very famous one, is Ha-Joon Chang. He actually did a study of many countries around the world back in the 19th century and 20th century. It says that development...
we have a short question,
sure,
sorry, we're running out of time.
Forgive
me, but I just...
Economic development, democracy is not a prerequisite for economic development. So these countries actually trying to move towards authoritative government and strengthen that authority in order to get better in economics and to strengthen their economies. So is that what you actually think about, Britain and the US is trying to do the same thing?
Good. That was a long question. I want a shorter question from the gentleman up here. Have you got that? Have you got?
Yeah, I've got it.
That?
Yeah, I've got it. Yeah.
My question
Could you keep it quite short because we've got lots of people who want to ask questions.
To what extent do you think nationalism is really the problem? We haven't spoken about it much. The resurgence of nationalism in perhaps Europe and in the US, and the strengthening of nationalism in other countries like Turkey, Russia, China.
Great. Okay. So I think we'll deal with those two. It was authority and democracy and economic growth was, I think, the first one, and the second one was about nationalism.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in terms of authority and growth, I think there are different ways of skinning the cat. I think what's an observation, I suppose, rather than an answer. Observation is that here in the West, United States, Western Europe, and so on, it seems to me that a lot of the growth, the drivers, technology, and so on and so forth, are directly competing interests with those of the state. I think that's a potential problem. They're very disruptive, but they're tax efficient, if you call it that, or you could be more aggressive if you wanted to phrase it differently. But their interests are not about functioning within a state-based organisation or within, and so when there's a misalignment of shareholders and business owners with the interests of the state, I think that's problematic, and that's not the same rhythms you have with state-owned companies, for example, in China, Russia, and so on, where there's a much closer relation between what those longer-term interests might be. That presents obvious benefits in some ways. There are obviously problems as well, but it seems to me that some of the big organizations we have today in the world, the Facebooks, the Apples, and so on, who have hundreds of billions of dollars parked offshore, means that with the FBI case of hacking the phone from Apple, when the state requires or demands something to happen and the private company stands up in defiance of it, then you can see where those efficiencies are going to be problematic and authorities collapse. As far as nationalism, I think the only honest answer I could say is I've got absolutely nothing original to say at all. So I don't want to waste anyone's
But
time.
I mean, it was interesting, the issue about nationalism. I mean, funnily enough, from my point of view, in terms of looking at political, daily political issues, foreign affairs, that kind of thing. I mean, nationalism was very much a buzzword, I would say, in the 90s and possibly in the early sort of 2000s. And particularly when one came across nationalism in Eastern Europe. I mean, that was in our lifetime, that was a big way of describing the sort of things that were going on there. I think it's very interesting now that a lot of the issues regarding Islamic fundamentalism and the kind of Western response are kind of transnational. So I don't hear that much talk about nationalist movements. I mean, maybe in the context of Putin, possibly the Ukraine. But, what MI5 and MI6 are dealing with, and the Foreign Office, is things like Islamic fundamentalism, which again is not a particularly nationalist-focused inquiry. I mean, nationalism was, in a way, one could argue that nationalism was very much a feature of the 20th century. It exists now, it's a problem, but it's not it doesn't encompass all the problems that we're facing. I mean, that would be my observation. Should we have a few more questions? I can't really see the balcony very well. Are there any questions does anyone else want to chip in from the balcony? Yeah. Oh, not quite the balcony, but yeah, you go for it. Go for it. There are people on top. You can't see them, but they are there.
I realised that this is...
Do you want to wait for a microphone?
I realise that this is, in a sense, counterfactual history, and that brings us a whole host of unique problems. But if, say, over the last 20, 30 years, you could change one thing, if you had the power of a god, you could change one thing that you reckon would make Britain a better place, a more global place, like what you were talking about, its sense of insularity, what would it be?
Do you want to answer that? I mean, that seems to stand alone as a question. Should we just do that? Break it up?
Yeah. I would never allow Big Brother to be on the TV.
That's very good. I think that was a brilliant answer, because that actually opens up a whole area of inquiry. I mean, Big Brother completely changed the nature of entertainment, the nature of participation, and it led to the X Factor, it led to indirectly to The Apprentice, it led to Donald Trump, it led to...
and we're all special. We could all be special,
That's right. That's a very good... Yeah. It's a very good answer. Okay, let's take a group of questions. This gentleman here, lady with a pen in her hand, and the gentleman with the blue shirt behind her. So we'll take it in that order.
Do you think citizens should have greater political apathy if politicians are, as you say, are standing in the wave of unbearable change?
Did you say that?
That's for me.
Did you say that?
I don't think so. Well, I must have said something similar.
You were hearing something different.
Okay, that's one.
And the lady with the pen in her hand.
Just up here.
Have you got? Great. Thank you.
I just, drawing from the first sentence of the title, The Return of History, I wondered if you connect our, as you describe it, our flawed foreign diplomacy with our sense, perhaps, that we still govern, or we haven't shaken off the notion that we govern a huge pink empire, and therefore this so-called special relationship that we often think we have, which I personally don't believe is the case, stems from a sense of self-importance and arrogance that we don't seem to be able to shake off.
Okay, and the young man behind you.
Thanks. I suppose my question would be about why, if sort of Europe's fading so much, there happens to be such a sort of migrant crisis, or so many people who want to come to Europe. And then with London in particular, London's often seen as the world's leading city. It was in the Evening Standard the other day. How can Britain be sort of fading, or the future be so bad, when London's doing so well as the rest of the UK?
It's a very good point. Do you want to deal with all those three? I mean, I've got an observation about what you said.
Yeah, go on, you go.
And I'll say that I'm always struck by Americans complaining about how America is going to the dogs. And typically, when I'm in Washington or New York, the people who are complaining about it are mega billionaires. who have no interest in emigrating from America. So clearly it's worked for them at some level. And they don't really feel that, that their position is under any real threat, because they would have left, much like the Russians did. So it's a strange paradox that we complain about, imminent decline, and yet we boast at the same time that our house prices are going up.
Well, okay, so I'll be a bit more aggressive than that. We last month tried to cut disability benefits.
You should stand for Parliament. I'm just thinking about this. You're absolutely. Sounds like it reminds me of the hustings I've been on.
We tried to cut disability benefits. So the idea that we're growing and it's all going to be tickety-boo, London is the United Kingdom, first of all. Sure. And so, I think one needs to be sanguine about that. I think combining the two with the lady in front, I think it is, the reason people come here is because people believe that the British are fair, they believe that we have a good legal system, and they feel their rights will be protected. And that is something which we should be intensely proud of. And personally, that's why I think that we should open our doors much wider than we do. So I happen to know that we have, in London, this great urban city, and the number of Syrian refugees that have been resettled in the last 6 years is 43. Not 43,000, it's 43. Okay? Those are not
okay, let me just turn this on. I mean, this is very interesting. So where do you live?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to tell you.
Well, I think you mentioned North Oxford.
If you ask me aggressively, yeah. I live in Oxford. Yeah, I live in Oxford.
And how many migrants have been settled there?
Well, I'm a migrant. My mother's Swedish. My father, my father's a refugee at the end of the Second World War. I'm not typical of anything. And I'm not going to try and use my own experiences to try to make general points. But I think that the reason my parents came here, and the reason why lots of people's parents came here, or the grand ancestors came here, the reason why all of Western Europe has been settled by migrants coming from the East. We're all parts of waves of migration through from 4000 BC, the next wave at 2,500 BC, through the Goths, the Huns, and so on and so forth. That constant migration, because Europe wasn't a settled continent. I think it's very easy to have that sense of entitlement and feel that we should lock the door after we've got in ourselves. But I think that the things that I'm most proud of about this country abroad are the fact that we treat people fairly, with respect, and we have a legal system that is the best of the world.
And what about this question about politicians wanting to sweep them out of the way?
Well, I'm sure that you've got a long list of people you like. Not on your own side.
I wouldn't divulge. I mean, there are many, mostly on my own side, but but that's always the case in politics.
Look, there's, you were slightly rude about me, Kwasi, being an academic, thinking I must be idealised. There is no perfect system.
I was just having fun.
There's no perfect world where everything works, but it seems to me that we are particularly, and I don't mean Britain, that the Western bicameral democratic, which is after all better than Italy until Berlusconi, that Italians changed governments all the time. There was no chance of getting anything done. But it seems that there is a structural blockage of how do we engage with other parts of the world. It doesn't help that our MPs, Kwasi is a very notable exception, are not very well informed about other parts of the world. We laugh about how American senators, how few Americans have passports and so on. But, we don't have expertise in the Houses of Parliament about these huge parts of the world. We don't have expertise. And the point about return of history, really the point is that we need to understand our own past. We need to understand it away from this sugar-coated way which we teach it and think that we have reached to where we are. Because, even very basic, my book is a history book. We were talking about today and the world of tomorrow. But, even things like the European engagement with slavery. One of the things I write about in my book is that the word ciao, when you go to Italy and you have a cocktail or a cappuccino and you say ciao to the barman, you actually say schiavo. It's a Venetian slang for I'm your slave. Because the Europe came out of the Dark Ages because we sold our women and children in huge numbers into the Islamic world. And I can tell you that not just because of the slave buying guides, not just because of the literature, which can be misleading, the equivalents of the Guardian and the Daily Mail of the time, but because we have silver coin finds going up the Russian river systems from the Arabic-speaking world north. And that scale is not to be measured in its tens or hundreds of thousands, but in its millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions. And that movement of people, migration and so on, it's important that we understand that is part of our cultural and our political and economic histories. And if we're disengaged from the reality, then it's very hard for us to see these connections.
I think we've got time for probably 2 or 3 questions, so stick your hands up.
Can they be easy ones?
Can they be easy ones? Did you hear that? Okay, I'm going to take 4 quick ones. Can we have 4 quick ones? The gentleman there, with the pencil, you in the blue shirt.
Woman.
You with the pen.
Balance.
No, I'm definitely keen on that.
Yes.
And you, sir, in the shirt, and you with the tie. So those 4. Very quickly.
To make that 5.
Okay, a bonus one. We'll have no, let's have 4, and then we'll have 1 at the end.
Okay, this is a question about the Middle East, and recently, after the Arab Spring and the aftermath, Tunisia has probably been the one example that has succeeded. Now, do you think Tunisia serves as a model for the rest of the Arab world to emulate? Because its Islamist party Ennahda has recently been calling itself the Muslim Democrats, which seems to be modeling
Okay,
itself.
that's one question. And please, the other questions, can you be shorter than that one? Because we're not going to get through if they are very long questions. So keep it very short. The lady there, with you're looking around, and you've got your bag on your leg.
I'll just speak loudly. With the demise of the West and the growth of China and the East, what do you think the world's going to look like in 30 years?
Okay, 30 years.
Not just politically or economically, I'm talking about culturally and socially.
It's a very good question. And now you, sir, in the T-shirt.
My question is, do you think it's inevitable that the center of gravity in the world changes to east? Or would the decision makers decide it? I mean, for instance, Paul Kennedy makes a point that we were at this stage in 16th or 17th century, where China was contending to be a world power, but it burned its sheep and turned its back on the world.
Okay, that was a great question. So can we get this gentleman here? So I'm being a bit short, but we don't really have that much time, and I want to squeeze another. This gentleman here, then Peter will have a go, and then I'll have 1 bonus question at the end. But not you, sir. I mean, I'm afraid...
They're not all your constituency, are they?
They're not. They're not. I mean, if they were...
Trying to get votes for those.
If they were, we'd be here till about 11 o'clock.
I think you're safe, Kwasi. I think
My question, hopefully, Peter, is a quick one. My question is, with the combined knowledge that you've acquired over all these years and all that you know, if you had the ear of the world leaders, they sat down, and let's, God forbid, you become an MP, a minister, and a prime minister, and you're sitting in this table, what is it? What is the advice at the end of all this knowledge and wisdom you've acquired that you would pass on and enact?
Okay, those 4 questions. So we've got Tunisia. Is it a role model for other countries in the Middle East? We've got the demise of the West. With the demise of the West, what does 30 years' time, what does the world in 30 years' time look like? Could you hold your horses, sir? Please. And then we've got a question about the shift to the east, whether that's inevitable, and then the advice to the world leaders.
Tunisia, I think it's a work in progress. You know, the fragilities of what exactly is happening in North Africa. It's very hard to take a weather view on what tomorrow might bring. I think it's no. I mean, in my view, I think I was going to say it's no secret as though it's fact. My view is that I think we've handled the Arab Spring very badly in the Western world, no question about that, both in Libya and Egypt in particular, and Syria goes without saying. So, you know, I am perhaps less optimistic. You know, I hope Tunisia can survive through the storms that are battering it and so on, and it's a source of one green shoot and so on.
Can I just pick you up on that? What should we have done differently in the Arab Spring?
We shouldn't have put planes in the air above Libya and told the Qataris to fund getting rid of Gaddafi, building secure telecoms.
So we shouldn't have intervened in Libya?
Well, Gaddafi, you'll know, Kwasi, because you're a historian, in the 80s, Gaddafi was mad. He had a chemicals weapons program. He trained the IRA.
Anyway,
he got into Ukrainian nurses,
Sure.
and prescription drugs. And at the time, when William Hague said that it was time for him to go, that signal meant a lot in the Arab world.
Okay, no, I agree with that. Okay, so
the world in 2030. Well, there's a chap called Philip Tetlock who's a behavioural psychologist, and he has proved that blindfolded chimpanzees are more accurate with darts than economists or future gazers of what might happen.
Sure.
So I'm not going to be. I'm not going to be drawn into it, except for to say, you know, the fragilities of what might happen in Saudi and in Iran or in China and so on, or an unexpected. You know, I've just been in Kazakhstan where there's been a terrorist attack earlier this week, where, you know, who knows exactly what's going on. These small events could mushroom into something much, much bigger. I think that if the ship keeps sailing in its particular way. The Chinese are expected to take 44% of the world's luxury goods in the next 10 years' time, and that will change. It's a very neat line I get to say at the end of my book. We're now selling silks back to China, Prada, Gucci, and so on and so forth.
So that leads into the sort of turn east, the shift east. I mean, you ask whether it's inevitable or whether we can do something to decisions. Okay.
I think my view is that what matters in the world are resources, and that's not just oil and gas, which clean tech is going to supplant at some point, I suppose, but it's things like food, clean water, all the things we need for our mobile phones, the beryllium, the dysprosium for our laptops, and we in the West don't have anything. We never have done. We've got a financial services sector where if I was able to talk to Kwasi, anticipating the next one, I'd put in prison some of the directors of publicly quoted companies like RBS who defrauded their customers. But the only people who pass proper fines on those are the European Union, by the way. So that's a separate story. So I think that you would look at where the things that matter are, and for countries that have agricultural sectors, energy sectors, and so on, and we in the West have to marshal our resources carefully.
The piece of advice?
The piece of advice,
Does that dovetail? You're going to lock everyone up?
Despite writing a book that's called History of the World, I'm by nature modest man, so I don't like to drop names. But I was in Central Asia last week with Romano Prodi, Ehud Barak, François Fillon, Alexander Kwaśniewski, and Alfred Gusenbauer, the former Chancellor of Austria, where people do sit. Interestingly, guess how many people were there from Britain?
0.
Yeah, that tells its own story.
But I mean, this has been a complaint about the British House of Parliament for about 300 years, by the way.
Well, there is a point, you'll understand what I mean with that, and it's not you or your colleagues specifically, but that sense of entitlement that we can worry about our own backyard without trying to understand the bigger picture. I'm a historian, and that's what I do for my living, but you do need to understand the past properly to have a sense of the present day.
Okay, we're going to have one more question, because we're reaching the end. And I'm going to pick very randomly. Is there anyone? The gentleman here has tried to get in for a while, so I'll give it to you.
To what extent, going forward, do you see Brauddel's approach to history, the primacy of geography, as being relevant?
It's a great question. Actually, can I I didn't bring this in. Braudel had this wonderful phrase, which you're probably aware of, but your book actually is almost a kind of brilliant variation and exposition of this phrase. He said that you've got to look at Europe as a peninsula on the edge of the Asian landmass, and actually Peter's written arguably one of the best books, and certainly the most comprehensive book that does that. And so I don't know.
$10.99 after the show.
No, but I mean, because we didn't talk enough about, as much as perhaps I would have liked, about your inspirations as a historian.
Well, in my introduction, my last sentence had been from Braudel, which said, Braudel puts it very elegantly. He says, the job of a historian is to be brave and to try and write about things that are uncomfortable. And let know whatever problems you have with my book, don't attack me for being overambitious. And my editor said, Fishwick, get rid of it. Get rid of it.
Yeah.
So take that.
He's my editor as well.
So I said it's very important that I put that in, so that I say that I'm trying to make the sense of it. I'm not trying to whatever. And he said, just get rid of it. People, if they're going to attack you, they're going to attack it. That's right. And if they're not, they're not. And it is a very. I don't quite know why I did it. It's a very bold thing to try to reconfigure the world in this way, to read these sources and put them all out on display, because you are asking someone to chop your head off and tell you that you made mistakes. Sure. So there is a sort of humility, I think, in listening to people say such nice things about it. I'm thrilled. But one of the themes in the book that comes back and back again is the effect that climate change has on the formation of some of the great big land empires in history, particularly on the Huns and on the Mongols. That climate events, through whether it's volcanic eruptions, whether it's through shifts in polar ice caps and so on and so forth, have a profound effect on the rhythms of global trade, on movements in political power, and so on and so forth. And so that fits in with this world of of Braudel and Montesquieu, where your climate, if it rains a lot, what is actually going to happen if your crops get flooded and suddenly the agricultural sector in whether it's our country or elsewhere, becomes unproductive, or parts like of the Aral Sea mean that you're putting people out of work.
Could I just say that was, as a last question, I could not have scripted it more beautifully, because actually that was one of the things that I probably should have brought up, and you've closed it beautifully in terms of your approach to history. Fernand Braudel, the great French historian, a possible, a definite inspiration. And actually it fits in with what we started off with at the beginning about, the limitations that, frankly, a lot of British historians have, we don't have this grand view, if you like. And I think the Silk Roads is very un-British in the best possible way, in that way, and that you've got the breadth of view and you've got a geographical range, which is hugely impressive.
Well, on that, because then you could... I'm incredibly grateful to Hannah and Intelligence Squared for getting me here this evening. I'm incredibly grateful to Haywood Hill for doing the books outside. Please don't just support me, support them. Independent booksellers are important. And to Kwasi giving up his time. For those of you who are not entirely convinced by my performance, I heard Margaret Atwood talk earlier this year, and she said she hates talking in public because if you like pate, you should never try to beat the duck. So the book is much more eloquent and much more fluent than I am. But I'm very grateful for this evening and to all of you for coming this evening.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks very much.